David Hall, thank you for joining us today at the Texas Law Center. It's a pleasure to have you be part of this program.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, Harper.
I want to start back at the beginning. What made you want to become a lawyer in the first place?
Well, like most lawyers, I got tired of going to med school or trying to go to med school. I was here in Austin, the University of Texas, in undergraduate school, and decided that the track that I really wanted to be on was going to law school. And so I kind of saddled up that horse and rode it right on through.
Couldn't do math or science, is that what you're saying?
That's where I was.
Okay.
Organic chemistry, I think.
I understand. Where did you grow up?
Baytown, East Texas, Goose Creek, part of Baytown. Then came to the University of Texas in 1960 and graduated 64 in undergraduate school and 69 in law school.
Now, what did you do upon leaving law school?
Well, I had dropped out of law school to join the Peace Corps in about 1966, spent 2 years in Venezuela. Decided that I had not been able to accomplish very much in the way of organizing the communities of Venezuela. And if I was going to do something very useful, I needed to finish off that law degree. And I'd always wanted to practice law down on the border where I could use the Spanish. So I ended up waiting around for a phone call about the Legal Services Corporation getting organized, and it didn't. Jim DeAnda, who you may have known, was with Texas trial lawyers at the time. He was trying to organize something called Texas Rural Legal Aid, and had been unable to get it going by the time I graduated. So I got a call from the Cesar Chavez Union, the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee at the time, and they needed a lawyer, so I went down to do that. And packed up my family and my 1 month old, and we moved down to the Valley, and I spent the first 2 or 3 years working for the United Farm Workers, and then that project was taken over by the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation out of New York to do affirmative litigation around water access issues for poor people. So I did that for another 2 or 3 years, and by then Texas Rural Legal Aid was up and running, and I was by then the chair of the board, and so they had to hire me as executive director.
So you were the first executive director of Texas Rural Legal Aid?
No, I was actually the second. Jerry Covington was the one just before me, and Halbert Steele it was the first director that we hired. I was on the board originally,
okay,
and spent 5 years on the board of the program, and then became executive director in '75.
Well, I see a theme here of public interest from your time in the Peace Corps to the jobs that you accepted after law school. What is it that drove you that direction?
Oh, I would imagine it was the family. They were pretty firmly. My father worked for Exxon. That was his public service. We had lots of vigorous debates about it, but I was pretty committed to that side of the practice, and I've always thought that the profession needed to have people out there that were advocating for that part of the population, and so that's what led me to do it.
What did the Peace Corps add to your background that made you a better lawyer?
Well, it certainly gave me the Spanish, and that was critically important to what I ultimately ended up doing. So that was important. But you know, the ability to go out and work with the kind of folks that I was working with in Caracas and on the island of Margarita, it was a poor community wherever I was, and my wife at the time. And we found that it was critically important to have advocacy skills. And that's where I first started applying something of the law school, the first year of law school, and seeing how that would work out. At the same time, I was realizing the limitations of not being licensed to be an advocate to the level that I wanted to be. So it was with renewed vigor when I went back to law school to follow up on that.
You're a different kind of law student when you returned, I guess.
Absolutely.
It changed.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the Farm Workers Union. What was that work like? What were you primarily doing?
Well, for the first few months, I felt like I was kind of a bait for the union. One of the things they were doing was trying to attract people into the union, and by having free lawyers, there was no legal aid program at the time in South Texas. And they commandeered a doctor, Ramiro Caso, to be the free doctor. So they had a free doctor and 3 free lawyers. One of my classmates, Peter Williamson, who practices immigration law in Houston now, and a guy named Roger Dunwell, who was from New York. And the 3 of us were there to attract members to the union. But fairly rapidly after that, we got involved in all kinds of fairly serious litigation. I remember the first case that I ever filed in federal court was a suit against the governor and the Department of Public Safety over surveillance. We were not very popular in those days, affectionately known as communists, and secessionists and seditionists, and you name it.
Any other ists they could come up with?
Any other ist that was available. And so I got Philemon Vela, who went on to become a federal judge, because I wasn't out of law school long enough to file a federal lawsuit. So Judge Vela and I went to court on that one within about 3 months after law school. So it morphed from a lot of individual service work. I think when I woke up and decided that I couldn't take 300 cases a month, that we had to start moving in other directions. But we did a lot of civil rights work, a lot of criminal defense work. I got involved in a number of those kind of cases.
Well, it sounds like the union, maybe for its own purposes, but really formed the first real legal aid office in the Valley.
It did, and it was, it was an unfortunate time. I think the organized bar was fairly hostile in those days. I remember a visit from one of the lawyers from Morris Atlas's firm came over to explain to us that we were practicing law in corporate form, and that was a no-no. So we had some discussions about that. That finally faded away, but it was tough back in those days. Jim DeAnda had some difficulties in getting the bar to accept legal aid for what it was. And it was, it's took a couple of decades before the bar really came around. And of course today, people like you and some of your more recent predecessors and people like Jim Sales, the bar leadership at the state level has been incredible in this turnaround in terms of support.
After you stopped doing the kind of individual cases for a while, you got involved on behalf of the union, I guess, in larger causes or more class action type litigation?
Well, some of it was class action. Some of it was just enforcing existing labor laws and that kind of thing. We did the work for the United Farm Workers. We did work for other community organizations down there. Some of it was political. A lot of it was plain vanilla kind of stuff. Some of it was, like indicated, criminal defense work. There was a big turning point in 1971 after a riot in Farr, and the district attorney down there at the time indicted virtually everybody associated with the union except me, and that's probably because he couldn't spot me. But we ended up defending those cases, those criminal cases, and a lawyer named Warren Burnett, who you may have known, right. Came down and worked with me for almost 2 years and tried the central case in that group in 1972. And that was kind of a watershed in the development of political history in the Valley. From when I first went down there was virtually no Mexican Americans at the courthouse in Edinburgh and Cameron County for that matter too. And After 72, there was a fairly dramatic transformation in local politics, and you began to see a lot more Mexican Americans on the bench, and began to see more and more in the bar and taking political office. So it was a big watershed.
Well, unlike most of us, you really started your career representing unpopular causes at the time, so something that maybe the society wasn't all for. What was that like as a young lawyer?
Well, it was like drinking out of a fire hose. There was just so much stuff going on, and there were so few of us. TRLA got organized about 1971. And that helped a lot in taking over the burden of a lot of the day-to-day litigation and casework. And it was a good symbiotic relationship between the operation that I was involved in. Jim Harrington came on board in our shop around 1973, and he and I shared a lot of that litigation, but it moved in various directions. But it was always pretty intense stuff. I mean, there was it was difficult in those times operating in that environment. There was some hostility directed at us, Jim and me, because we were Anglos, were operating primarily in a Hispanic world, and we were getting some hostility from both the Anglo establishment and the young kids in the Mexican American community. But there were incredibly rewarding times too, in terms of feeling the impact of it all.
Did it coincide somewhat with the civil rights movement in general?
It did. South Texas was probably a decade behind what was going on in the rest of the country. I went through law school and undergraduate school in the 60s when that was just emerging here in Austin. And then by the time I got down to the Valley in the late 60s and early 70s, you were beginning to see the beginnings of that activity down there, and lots of marches and demonstrations and strikes by the union. So there was it was an era with a lot of activity going on.
I'm going to show my ignorance here, and I apologize historically, but was Cesar Chavez still living when you went to work for the union?
Oh yeah, he was the director of the union in California. And I got to know all of those folks.
Right.
Chavez would come visit once or twice a year. The guy that I actually worked for most of the time was Antonio Orendain. He was one of the original founders of the United Farm Workers, along with Chavez and Dolores Huerta and some of those well-known figures. And then he came to Texas in the 66, 67 around a strike in Starr County, and then returned in 69 to try to organize the union at that time. And then he's remained down there and continued. He separated from Chavez in 75 and then set up his own union. And by then I was over at TRLA, and we ended up representing both the United Farm Workers people and Texas Farm Workers folks in a number of labor actions up through 1980, 81 period. And then all that activity kind of died out after a while.
Right. Well, you've mentioned a number of names that are giants in the area you work in, Judges DeAnda and Vela. Warren Burnett, one of the great trial lawyers in Texas. Who were some of the people that really helped you get this underway?
Well, Jim DeAnda was incredible. He was the father of TRLA. And then he went on to the bench, and it was always lots of fun to take cases to Judge DeAnda. Chris Dixie, I don't know whether you ever knew Chris. He was a labor lawyer out of Houston, was probably my first mentor, because when we got down there was nobody to turn to. So Chris had handled a lawsuit by the United Farm Workers against the Texas Rangers over that Starr County strike in '66, '67, and taken it all the way to the high court. And so when I came on board, Chris asked me to take on some local responsibilities on that case, and so we got to know each other pretty well. So whenever I would run into any issues involving labor law or whatever, civil rights, anything, I had somebody I could call. So he was critically important. I got personally so much mileage out of people like that. Warren Burnett and Chris Dixie and Jim DeAnda was always ready to come by and educate us on the law. So it was an amazing period.
Well, and I think Warren Burnett's son Abner works for you now. Is that?
Abner does. He's our chief public defender in Willacy County. Yes.
Okay, so it's an interesting cycle or circle, if you will, I guess.
It is indeed. Abner is just every once in a while, Abner says something, and I say, "Oops, Warren's in the room."
That's right. He's quite a guy. Well, just as an aside, I was paid as a young lawyer to watch Warren Burnett try a criminal case. Drilling company sent me over to watch, and what a thing to get paid for.
It's an amazing. It's equally good not getting paid for it, but working with him in a 2-week trial was just an amazing education.
Well, then let's talk about your move over to TRLA and a little bit of that history, how you've grown that organization. And I know that you've been through a lot of ups and downs. Politically, that the support has come and gone, if you will. Tell us about your early days at TRLA.
Well, the very earliest was when it was getting the board organized, right. And I'd been down there for a few months, and I had agreed to serve as a client representative on the board because I was an eligible client for TRLA at that time. And Jim DeAnda thought that was unseemly, so he paid my dues for the Texas Trial Lawyers Association so he could make me a TTLA representative to the board. And TTLA actually organized the program. And
that's the Texas Trial Lawyers Association, the plaintiff's bar.
The plaintiff's bar, right. So they got the program organized. We had our first organizational meeting, and it was pretty clear how things were going to be divvied up in the program in terms of who was supportive and who wasn't. But over a period of time, generally the opposition from the local lawyers to the program began to dissipate, particularly amongst those who were on the board. And after a year or two on the board, I was noticing that people got much more supportive of what this was about and began to understand the need for it. And to sit there in these board meetings with client representatives who were the direct recipients of the services and hear them tell their stories. We do that pretty much every board meeting. We have a time allocated for clients to talk about what's going on in their communities and in their lives. And lawyers that are not exposed to that in their daily practice found that very educational.
Kind of opened their eyes.
Yeah. So that kind of process began to move things along. When the vacancy for the executive director came open in got I threw my hat in the ring. We ended up it got kind of funny because at the end, when they got down to two candidates, I got the votes of all the Mexican Americans, and the Mexican American retired Air Force colonel got all the votes of the Anglos on the board. And so we had ethnically polarized voting on the TRLA board. But that rapidly faded away, and the period from 75 to 80 was mostly a period of major growth. We went from about 9 counties down there to 47. That period also saw us get some specialized funding for migrant farm workers, and we opened up an office up in the Panhandle. We had offices all over the brush country in South Texas, and El Paso was part of that expansion. We went from about 10 or 11 lawyers when I was hired to about 50 lawyers, just a little under 50 lawyers. It was by 1980 we had reached our funding zenith. We were funded at the national level at what would today be about $800 million, as opposed to what we actually get this year, which is about $390 million.
Right.
So, and it was all federal funding back in those days. There was not a nickel of state money anywhere. So that's all we had to work with. But we were moving the program in a very expansive sort of way, and then the brakes went on in 1981.
Now you've kept your acronym throughout, but your name has changed.
The name did change.
Tell us about that.
Well, we merged with 4 other programs in 2001, 2002, and amongst the programs were the ones serving here in Austin and San Antonio, and they took umbrage at being considered rural.
Okay.
Even though I had some rural roots here in Travis County, they didn't see the charm of that. So we decided that we needed a new name to reflect what the program had become. And by then we'd ended up with from 10 or 11 programs in Texas to 3, and they were all huge. Right. TRLA is the 3rd largest in the country and covers an area that is dominated by the border on the southwest, so the Rio Grande. We insisted on spelling Rio Grande as one word rather than 2 words to avoid TRGLA, which immediately would be called troglodytes. So we had to be careful about the acronym.
That's a good idea. You probably knew from your early days that you needed to be careful of any teasing you would take.
Well, in naming community organizations or any organization, you got to think of the acronym first. Right. Go backwards from that.
Work from there. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit, because those of us who don't swim in these waters all the time don't really understand how important the transition was to federally funded legal services corporations. What kind of difference did that make in what you were able to do in communities and for real people?
Well, what it meant was from 0 to at least marginally adequate funding, and at least marginal coverage everywhere. That was huge. Every county in Texas by 1978, somewhere in that range, had some kind of access. It wasn't great access, but it was some kind of access. And so that was a tremendous difference. And up until then, there were some bar association programs, which were mostly pro bono. There were a few programs around that had staff attorneys. Actually, in Austin, when I was in law school, we tried to organize one of the early programs, clinic programs affiliated with the university, but there really wasn't anything here. Houston had a program, I think Dallas did, but once you got outside of those urban centers, there was not even a semblance of access for poor people if they had a legal problem. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that poor people have the same kind of numbers and intensity and quality of legal problems that other people do. And they just seem to get more of it at one time when they fall into a crisis mode, which if you're not making if you're making minimum wage or less, you're always in a crisis mode.
So it's not just the divorce or the custody issue, no. It all comes crashing.
It all comes crashing down. If you lose your job, and we're very familiar with that these days, then and you have one hospital bill, even if you haven't lost your job, having a hospital bill can kick you over the edge. And then you lose cars, you lose houses, you lose your ability to function in the community. You're thrown into a safety net that's not very safe, and it's very intense.
Well, I think it's obvious how that impacts the individual. How does it impact our society when that happens, when somebody is pushed over the edge, so to speak?
Well, everybody else in the society at some level has to step up to help out, or we just ignore the problem. And we've done a pretty good job over the years at times of ignoring the problem. But I think we're reaching that stage of that level of in our body politic that we don't do that as much as we used to. And having adequate medical services, having some level of access to the judicial system and the legislative system, all of that helps out and gives people who do hit that point some feeling that things can change and some level of optimism. And that's critically important, I think, to the safety of any kind of a society. You've got to have that belief out there at the core.
And taking it down even to the next level, why is it so important to the judicial system or our constitutional form of government that everybody have access to justice?
Well, I fundamentally believe that that's what is the essence of society. If we're going to live as a community in which everybody has an equal shot at succeeding, an equal shot at just simply living, because a lot of these are life and death issues, that the society as a whole has to take responsibility for that. And an essential part of it, of society functioning, is the ability to resolve conflict. And when somebody is in dire straits, conflict arises. It's the nature of the beast. And it's lawyers and the judicial system and the legislative system that are there to resolve those conflicts, hopefully peacefully. That's what we're here for. And if you don't have that outlet, bad things can happen.
I guess that's the line between the system we have and chaos, so to speak.
Or chaos, or even worse, a dictatorship. Dictators can sometimes resolve those kind of issues for you, but we don't like them very much.
No, that doesn't sell too well. Well, you know, I don't want to get too bogged down in funding, but I do think it's important for those of us who haven't followed this. And candidly, in the last 2 years, I've learned a lot about it. And I want others to learn a lot about it because things changed in the 1980s for the Legal Services Corporation. You were kind of on an upswing. Tell us about that period and where we stand today and what the problems you're facing today are.
Well, in the 80s, we lost about a third of our funding during the Reagan administration. Reagan tried to eliminate the Legal Services Corporation. He spent 2 or 3 years trying that, and that didn't work, mainly because the organized bar came out in droves and made such a huge difference. Bill Whitehurst, one of your predecessors in office around here, was instrumental in organizing bar leaders for the preservation of legal services, a major national organization that rallied to the cause. Reagan unsuccessfully attempted to abolish the Legal Services Corporation, but was able to reduce funding by about a third. And add a bunch of restrictions to the kind of work that we could do. After Reagan, in the 90s, the first Bush administration, things relaxed a little bit. Legal Services Corporation was still, kind of aloof, but not as hostile. I mean, for a period of time there, the corporation was just absolutely hostile. They were trying to destroy the program from within. The first George Bush appointed people to the board who were much more supportive of the program. And funding began to pick up a little bit, at least stabilized. It didn't get chopped nearly so much. Then the Clinton administration, we saw a resurgence in funding. It brought it back up about another 10% over the 1/3 we lost. And that was good for a couple of years, and then there was the counterattack leading up to the what I refer to as the Contract on America in 1996, where funding was cut again by a third, and a bunch more restrictions that really caused serious problems in our ability to function. One restriction meant that any funds that we got from any source, any private donor, public donor, anybody was going to be encumbered with all the federal restrictions, class actions, attorney's fees, all those things.
Meaning that if a corporation, for example, wanted to fund a redistricting lawsuit, you couldn't do it or you'd lose all your federal funding.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. What were some of the restrictions and how did they impact the work you were doing? You've referred to class actions.
Right. We, at the time in 1996, when that restriction went in, we had about 60 class actions on the docket in various stages, some of them in the early stages, like the Frew case that challenged the state's administration of the CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance Program, that Susan Zinn has continued to litigate on her own time since then. That was one of them. We had most of them in the farm labor area. Farm workers typically go out and work as crews, 40, 50 people in one field doing the same thing and making the same kind of wages. So if one of them's injured, usually all of them are, so you'd bring a class action and it would be a much more efficient way of litigating that. And that was the real cause. The Farm Bureau got intensely involved in agitating against class actions because they did not like that part of the rule book, that being the federal rules, the civil procedure book, right. Rule 23 being very specific about it, and thought that it was unseemly that one guy could complain on behalf of everybody in the crew. So probably 30 or 40 of the cases were in that category. And that's been a huge problem. And we try to bring those cases today as mass actions where you name everybody in the crew. The problem with that is it exposes everybody on the crew to not only a lot of what can turn out to be fairly onerous discovery. It's not uncommon for a defense lawyer to want to take a deposition of everybody in the crew, which is his right if it's a mass action. But it certainly is time consuming, right. And it certainly drives up the costs of litigation. And it certainly drives out a lot of people who would otherwise have valid claims. Because the problem with migrants is they migrate, and keeping up with them is a difficult thing to do. So there's huge problems.
You have to call them back from Iowa for a deposition in Laredo. I guess it's a significant issue.
It is a significant issue, and it's an expensive issue. So,
well, and those restrictions remain in place today, as I understand.
They do, and at a time when funding is a major problem. Having those kinds of restrictions has really made it difficult, and the dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. The other big one that affected us was the attorney's fees restriction. There are a lot of statutes out there that we litigate under that allow for fee switching. And we used those to the extent of about $600,000 in revenue a year in the last few years of the mid-'90s. In today's dollars, with today's size of the staff, that'd probably be $2.5 million that we see as lost revenue. That was the money that kept us from going under back in the '90s. That's been a big loss.
And so basically what we have, for example, on a breach of contract case, any party in Texas can recover their attorney's fees except for the party represented by a legal services lawyer.
That's correct.
Okay. State funding has at some point in time came into play, and certainly the work of the Supreme Court in forming the Access to Justice Foundation. Tell us about the history of that and where we stand today in terms of funding legal services to the poor.
Well, I mean, the big thing, the big development in state funding, another watershed event was the interest on lawyer trust account program. And there was an effort to get that through the legislature in the 80s. That was not successful, but the Texas Supreme Court picked up that cause and adopted a rule. At the time, it was not mandatory, and it raised a significant amount of money. That's the first state funding for legal services. Probably $3 or $4 million in those early years. And as interest rates were fairly high, it went on up to about $10 million at one point. But then as interest rates are wont to do, they came down, and so did the proceeds on that. And the court made that program mandatory. And that was another huge boost for programs. We would, an event like that would see our budget go up like $1 million from what it had been. Then there were some other legislative initiatives like the filing fee add-on about 9 years ago, no, 11 years ago, because my wife was working on that one as a lobbyist,
right.
And we'd just gotten married, so I've got to remember that date. But the filing fee add-on was a big...
Which anniversary do you remember best, the filing fee add-on or your wedding anniversary?
They all were the same day, November the 7th. So
Okay.
Well, we saw the first dollar, so it was easy.
Yeah.
So adding that funding to as a permanent stream was a big improvement. And then there have been others that have been added virtually every session since then, which have made such a difference. Where now the Legal Services Corporation funded programs went from 100% federally funded to we're probably about 61% now statewide. So and it's state funding that's picked up the gap, and that's been a big difference. And seeing people on the Texas Supreme Court like Deborah Hankinson pick up that cause was a major. And then her portfolio was picked up by Harriet O'Neill and right. Wallace Jefferson, the chief, and other folks on the Supreme Court, and that's just been an amazing development. And the Access to Justice Commission. John Jones was the first chair from El Paso, and certainly very supportive. Jim Sales for the last number of years has just been incredible.
Heroic, I think, is a term we sometimes apply to it. He's made it his life's cause, I think.
There should be a beatification out there somewhere in his future.
Well, we're currently in a crisis, and I know that the bar, we publicize this a lot. I know you have to speak to it a lot, but we were in a good place with IOLTA accounts and the comparability rule, and suddenly, because of the economic downturn, we kind of have a double whammy. Right. You have more clients and less money.
That's right.
What do you think we as lawyers can do to help with that?
Call your senators this afternoon. Yeah. We're fighting for our lives virtually over in the legislature right now to try to find the vehicles to offset that. We're looking fairly good in terms of general appropriations. Will get us about halfway to where we need to be out of this session to make up for the loss of IOLTA revenue. We've got to make up the difference somehow or start cutting back. And that's been the saga. We have to ride that roller coaster, and some of those hills get pretty steep.
And I think for those of us who don't do this kind of work, it's important to understand the commitment that lawyers who come to work for you make. And it's hard to stop and start on that commitment, to come and go, if you will. Describe what it's like to attract and maintain, and you've done a remarkable job. I mentioned that at the outset. But to attract and maintain quality lawyers, because you're right, the poor's problems are as complex as those that are wealthy, yeah. and maybe more so, and certainly more life-threatening typically. Tell us what's hard about that, and how you've managed so far to kind of keep everything patched together.
Well, it's just constant juggling. You got to juggle the funding. You've got to juggle the expectations of staff. You've got to find ways to smooth out those peaks and valleys at the management level. But it really, more than anything else, comes down to getting the right people on board in the first place. It's the recruitment side of it. We've always done a national, not always, but certainly the last couple of decades, have done a national recruitment effort. And have been able to attract some really outstanding people. I mean, these are some of our folks, a lot of our folks would be leaving $150,000 on the table to take a $35,000 job with us.
And that's kind of the context. These are people who could go to a large law firm in a metropolitan area and make $160,000 a year, perhaps, right away.
There are those, but what is pretty uniform about, I think, our staff is that they're all committed. It's got to be a passion, whether you're going to leave a bunch of money on the table or you're going to go back and serve in a community that you grew up in, and you grew up poor. That kind of a commitment to me is equally striking.
Right.
Somebody who has worked their way through law school, and somebody like our friend Pablo
Right.
Almaguer. I mean, it's incredible that you find somebody who will make the kind of commitment. And I have found over the years that there's always, no matter what's going on in the national politics, local politics, or whatever, that there's always some element of the law students who want to do this kind of work. And the big problem is ferreting them out, finding who they are, identifying them.
Well, I guess one of the concerns that I could see you having would be in a funding crisis, though you have someone who I would call him a true believer, a Pablo, and funding gets cut and they have to go do something else for a while. That's a loss that you can't just replace right out of law school when the time comes back around.
No, I mean, we're in that mode right now. We're not we've only had to lay one off this year, but we've lost about 7 others to attrition. And we can't replace them because we don't have the funding prospects out there to be able to tell somebody with a straight face that you've got a job for as long as you want it. So, I don't mind lying to law students, to telling them that Beeville has a really good orchestra and that they will find all of the social amenities in downtown Weslaco. I don't mind telling them things like that, but I do like to see some funding out there that allows us to keep them on salary. So that's always been a problem. We've never been able to guarantee job security for anybody. So anybody comes into this work, they understand that. But at the same time, you got to keep those expectations up there that we're going to meet payroll. Right. And I've had our staff in years past, when we hit one of these funding bumps, who will say, I'd rather take a funding cut than lose a colleague. So we've managed over the years to cut salaries down to bare
So people who are already sacrificing make another sacrifice.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's interesting to me, we talk about leveraging a lot, and I think that Legal Services to the Poor is the master at leveraging the dollar. But I was listening yesterday to the law school deans talk about they would give debt forgiveness to someone, but it requires a legal services job to be funded and be there for that to work, and that's a problem in the current environment, I suppose.
It is. I mean, we've lost some outstanding applicants this year that we just couldn't take on, and they would either have to get a fellowship or we couldn't take action. That's why this session of the legislature is so critically important to us. If we don't get enough money to where we can say, okay, we can live for the next 12 months, right, then there's no hiring going on.
Well, and to put it in context, even before the drop in funding from IOLTA, we were serving what percentage of the poor in terms of access to justice?
Well, the number that we toss around a lot is based on a federal study, and it says something like 20%. But that's not reality. In our programs in Texas, we're probably serving 2% of the population a year. I mean, it is really low. And, you know, we're never going to get to the point of where there will be equal access. And of course, the Access to Justice Foundation dropped equal from its name a couple of years ago because the reality is not there.
Right.
But we do what we can, and we've got to have some minimum level of access out there just to keep the society functioning.
We've been through a lot of the progress of legal services to the poor, and really your career kind of tracks that in Texas. You were in the early phases of it, and you continue to toil in those vineyards. What would you see as the biggest changes?
Well, one of the biggest changes is the support from the bar, and I've mentioned that a few times. You know, in the early days, it was not there, and it was a real struggle. Economically, the judiciary, across the board. In the last decade, there's just been a radical transformation. The struggles in the 80s over the survival of legal services resulted in such broad support within the bar that had not previously existed. So that manifests itself in changes, not just in the funding, but in the way our lawyers are perceived in the courtroom. I think when we are involved in a case, there's a level of respect there that you might not have seen 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think the level of advocacy has always been fairly uniform over that period of time. We've always been able to track the good advocates, but that respect element is critically important, as you well know, as a trial lawyer. If people think that you've got the right sort of information for the court, and there's that level of trust and rapport, it makes a big difference. And so that's one of the biggest things I've noticed.
One of the things that interests me, and I'm going to maybe use some of the wrong words to ask this question, so forgive me, but you've almost gone from kind of a revolutionary status, if you'll pardon the use of that term, to a mainstream or establishment role as legal services to the poor. What has that been like for you, and what changes have you had to make in making that transition?
I haven't made any changes.
Ever the revolutionary?
Everything's come around. I really don't think I've made that many changes in it. I think the environment's changed a lot. And I think that's just the nature of an evolving society. The positions that we were advocating, and it's not just me, but there were a lot of colleagues who walked in the same path, those positions have just come to fruition now. The idea that people deserved lawyers no matter what kind of money they had in their pockets was probably a little radical in 1965, 1970 in many circles. It's not anymore. Right. And that's the difference. I think I'm probably advocating about the same sort of positions that I would have been 30, 40 years ago.
The society's catching up with you.
Well,
and your colleagues.
Yeah, I'll probably be the most conservative guy on the block in another 50 years.
Okay, well, I hope you make it for that. You know, it's interesting, though, in that time, you're bound to have faced some really challenging cases. Is there any case that sticks out in your mind that was a real challenge to you personally, that you found the most difficult, if you will?
Oh, there are a few that come to mind. We tried a case out in the Western District in Judge Lucius Bunton's court. Now, you probably know Judge Bunton.
I've tried a few cases in front of him myself.
I bet you do. And you know how fast that train runs. Right. We had one involving Presidio Valley farmers and farm workers from Ojinaga, Chihuahua, back in the late 70s, early 80s. And he got a hold of that case. We ended up running 507 witnesses. This was one of those cases that should have been a class action. The Fifth Circuit decided that it shouldn't have been. So Judge Bunton, as he's wont to do, seized control of that case in a hurry. He said, well, all right, we'll just listen to every one of these witnesses because that's what the defense wanted to do. Right. These were melon pickers and onion clippers, and they had the same identical story to tell for the most part, but he was willing to take as long as it was necessary. So we took over the Marfa courthouse for almost a year and tried that case. Logistically, a nightmare. It was, there were lots of major legal issues. We went up to the circuit twice on that case. It was almost a career. It lasted about 7, 8 years worth. But
you tried it to the bench?
We tried it to the bench, yes.
And he gave you that much time?
He
never gave me more than 2 days.
Yes, well, we would get 3 or 4 days a week. There was a Washington, D.C. lawyer that he didn't particularly cotton to. So he would try to set the case so that the local counsel from Pecos would be the one on the premises for the growers, because we all got along well with him.
Right.
And, but he would make sure that that Washington, D.C. lawyer didn't make the trek to Marfa.
Of course, Judge Bunton was from that part of the world. That's his hometown, so I'm sure it was interesting.
It was fascinating because I remember we had to transport all these workers in vans. We got some vans, and we had to transport them across Bunton Flats on the way to the courthouse.
That's right. So we're right across his grandfather's ranch.
That's right. That's right.
Well, that obviously was a difficult case. Is there any that stands out as interesting or poignant or humorous in your mind?
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of them over the years. I did manage to get one into the high court back in the late 70s, a grand jury discrimination case out of Hidalgo County. And that was an awesome experience for any lawyer. And right. We've had about half a dozen cases in the high court, but that's the only one I've ever argued, and that was certainly a high point in my, at that point, 5 years out of law school. So that
wow, that's pretty soon to face that kind of pressure.
It was, but the funny thing about it, when you're up there in that court, it's pretty intimate. The justices are right there in front of you, and it's carrying on a colloquy with them, and a few minutes after you get started. One of the problems in that case was my father had, being proud of his son for his first appearance in the Supreme Court, had bought me a new suit. And I was real busy at the time. I didn't have time to try it on. So I grabbed the suit at Dillard's on the way to the airport and put it on when I got ready to go argue the case. And, of course, the first thing that happens is it splits the pants right up the middle as I got out at the courthouse.
He remembered you as a little slimmer than you were.
I think he did. And so I argued that case with about a tear in the pants of my suit.
Your one great opportunity and your britches are torn out.
That's right. And I had to remember not to raise my hand.
No, you couldn't wave your arms.
Couldn't wave the arms.
Well, that may have helped you, actually.
It may have.
Well, what do you like to do when you're not practicing law and furthering your cause?
Well, I'm mostly a sailor these days when I have some time off. Pam and I have a boat, and we bought in Tampa, Florida in '05 in the great hurricane season of '05, and sailed it across the Gulf and parked it out at Port Isabel in South Padre Island. So
you sailed it back yourself?
Well, we hired a rent-a-captain to join us on that excursion.
Might be a good idea.
Right. So, but it was great fun.
Is that how you find your relaxation and gather your strength?
Oh yeah, it's good to get out there and mess around on the water. And Pam likes that we dump so much money on the boat. But
Well, tell us about Pam and your family. I know that she's been active in support of legal services to the poor in her career as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
well, Pam came into my life in the mid '90s when she was working at the Texas Legal Services Center and then became the lobbyist. We decided we needed some representation in the legislature to make the money flow. And she was the chief lobbyist on the first basic civil legal services funding, which was the filing fee add-on back in that day, the '97 session. And we got married that year, and she was so eager to move to the Valley. And I was living in a little 900 square foot house. And after a few months of that, she thought that she'd like to move her stuff in there too. So we ended up getting another house and have lived happily ever after since then. But Pam is, she's a consummate lawyer, Philadelphia lawyer, went to Penn, worked in a big firm for a while, but is passionate about the poor. She does an international child abduction practice for TRLA now. As a way to stay out of the legislature. I can't seem to get her up here very often, but she works with kids that are kidnapped, mostly in domestic violence situations, taken down to Mexico or vice versa. So she's got some Mexican lawyers that she works with that make appearances with her in courts down there. And she occasionally lets me go along to drive the car, but we've been down to the courts in Querétaro and Guanajuato and Veracruz, and it's a fascinating practice.
And important too.
It's
very important. Well, I've asked you a lot about the changes you've seen. Tell me what you see for the future of our profession, and particularly as it relates to those less fortunate in access to justice.
Well, if we can build on what's happened the last decade, I think, and I'm the eternal optimist, otherwise I couldn't keep doing this. I think we've got a good, strong future. I think my sense of where we are as a national society and as a Texas society is that we'll see more and more realization that we need to do better by these folks that have been left behind. There will always be those folks. We never are going to have to moan for the lack of clients. We don't spend a whole lot of time drumming up business. So the business is going to be there, and the question is going to be, do we have, as a community, the wherewithal to allow them to participate fully? And I'm optimistic that it's going to be there.
I'm going to loan you a John Kennedy quote. You probably have used it before, but he said, the society that cannot take care of the many who are poor cannot save the few who are rich. So, David Hall, it's been a pleasure having you here with us
Harper,
today.
thank you so much.
Thank you.